Chapter 5 Sovereignty, Friends and Enemies. Carl Schmitt is arguably the most important political and legal theorist of the 20th century. He produced a large body of work, and the secondary literature that has been produced on Schmitt could fill a small library. Much like the elite theorists, his analysis of power and politics was above all else realist, describing things as they are and not how they ought to be. Here I will focus only on his two most famous ideas: sovereign is he who decides on the exception, under the specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy. These are found in his two booklets, Political Theology, 1922, and The Concept of the Political, 1932, which were his fourth and 12th major publications respectively. I will be using the standard scholarly editions of these works, but they have been helpfully collected in the Sovereign collection by Antelope Hill, which makes a virtue of its lack of commentary or apologia. While many of the thinkers we have considered thus far have been controversial, Carl Schmitt is held responsible by some as providing the legal justification for the Nazi regime. This is beyond our scope, but it is worth knowing that in the 1970s, scholars such as George Schwab made great efforts to denazify Schmitt, and by the late 1980s the journal Telos had become and remains the house publication for Schmitt scholarship. By the end of the 1990s, far-left scholars were publishing their own book-length collections of essays on Schmitt. It is testament to the power of Schmitt's clarity and the penetration of his analysis that he could overcome the ultimate stigma and be rehabilitated by mainstream scholarship in this way. Much influenced by Thomas Hobbes, Schmitt saw the central role of governmental authority as one of maintaining order and stability. As we saw in Moscow, every ruling class must lean on a political formula to which the ruled subscribe to gain legitimacy. Even though every political formula will be rooted in claims that do not stand the test of empirical reality, as Pareto maintained, people irrationally believe them in any case despite the facts, almost as quasi-religious myths. Schmitt recognized something similar and called it political theology. He argued, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts not only because of their historical development, in which they were transferred from theology to the theory of the state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver, but also because of their systematic structure, the recognition of which is necessary for a sociological consideration of these concepts. The exception in jurisprudence is analogous to the miracle in theology. Only by being aware of this analogy can we appreciate the manner in which the philosophical ideas of the state developed in the last centuries. Perhaps this is why it rang so true when Herbert Spencer referred derisively to the divine right of parliaments in 1884. But we must separate the issue of legitimacy, which concerns consent of the ruled and the right of the rulers to rule, from that of sovereignty, which concerns who has functional authority in a state. In terms of sovereignty, Schmitt shows that there is substantially no difference between systems of absolutist monarchy, such as those supported by the throne and altar reactionaries such as Joseph de Maistre, and modern parliamentary systems with their supposed separation of powers. This will likely appear absurd to some. How could an absolutist monarch bear any relation to, for example, the US government with its careful system of checks and balances, its separation of the executive from the legislature and judiciary, and so on? The answer lies in the fact that Schmitt saw it fit to judge any political system not by its norms, but when it was under crisis. This was not a new move in the history of political theory. For example, in an inquiry concerning the principles of morals, 1751, David Hume asked, "Is it any crime, after a shipwreck, to seize whatever means or instrument of safety one can lay hold of, without regard to the former limitations of property?" Hume imagines a city under siege whose inhabitants were in danger of perishing with hunger or a civil war. In such conditions we expect the normal laws of justice to be suspended, because they no longer serve any purpose. It is here Schmitt would interject with his two favorite questions: who decides? Quis judicabit, who interprets? Quis interpretabitur? And hence his famous dictum, sovereign is he who decides on the exception. He says, precisely, a philosophy of concrete life must not withdraw from the exception and the extreme case, but must be interested in it to the highest degree. The exception can be more important to it than the rule, not because of a romantic irony for the paradox, but because the seriousness of an insight goes deeper than the clear generalizations inferred from what ordinarily repeats itself. The exception is more interesting than the rule. The rule proves nothing, the exception proves everything. it confirms not only the rule but also its existence, which derives only from the exception. In the exception, the power of real life breaks through the crust of a mechanism that has become torpid by repetition. We may consider, for example, the issue of the U.S. election of 2020, which was disputed by its official loser, Donald Trump, who alleged that his opponent, Joe Biden, had engaged in wide-scale fraud. This showed an amazed global audience the U.S. system under crisis. The Supreme Court would hear no cases and officially would review no evidence. It ruled that Texas and 17 other states had no standing. Over 7,000 sworn affidavits alleging fraud were effectively ignored by the American legal system, and that was in Michigan alone. We need only entertain a counterfactual: what if the charges had been the other way around? In fact, we glimpsed what that may have looked like in the Russiagate fiasco, which dogged Trump's presidency and mired it in legal challenges, indictments, FBI special investigations, and so on for nearly his entire term. The chief claims of Russiagate, which were loudly amplified by the media, were subsequently proven to have been fabricated during an investigation by FBI Special Counsel John Durham, with 2 indictments to date at the time of writing. However, by this time, after the fact, neither the media nor the public cared. A Schmittian analysis of these details would show us 3 things. First, Donald Trump, despite holding the office of U.S. President, never had sovereignty. Second, whoever is sovereign in the United States, which one suspects is neither Joe Biden nor the Supreme Court, did not like Donald Trump very much and sought to make him an exception. Third, there is no sovereignty in the people whatsoever, and the preamble of the U.S. Constitution, "We the people," is an empty slogan. While the elite theorists sought chiefly to attack democracy as a sham, Schmitt's main target was liberalism, which he believed constantly sought to obscure and obfuscate power behind legal fictions. For Schmitt, the sovereign authority not only was bound to the normally valid legal order but also transcended it. His sovereign slumbers in normal times but suddenly awakens when a normal situation threatens to become an exception. In this critical moment, sovereign power reveals itself in its purest form. It stands to reason, then, that because the sovereign decides the exception, he is not subject to the law. In fact, the sovereign not only decides the exception but also decides when order and stability are restored. It may surprise some people to learn that the United States has been in a near-continuous state of national emergency since 1917. Emergency executive orders dating back to the Jimmy Carter administration are still active. Powers invoked by George W. Bush to fight his war on terror were never rescinded. In the UK, the Coronavirus Act 2020 granted the government sweeping and unprecedented emergency powers over its subjects in a remit that extended far beyond the treatment of people infected with COVID-19, which include powers to detain potentially infectious persons, powers to prevent mass gatherings, mass surveillance powers, and the imposition of criminal sanctions for disease transmission. The initial indictment of Julian Assange in 2018 rested on the authority of Executive Order 13526 issued by President Barack Obama in 2009, which defined what counts as a secret, although he was later charged with 17 further charges, each of which carry a 10-year sentence. Viewed in this way, it is easier to understand Schmitt's insistence on looking at the exception rather than the theoretical norm. In theory, there is a legal norm, but in practice, we are nearly constantly in the exception. As Schmitt put it, all law is situational law. The sovereign produces and guarantees the situation in its totality. He has the monopoly over this last decision. Therein resides the essence of the state's sovereignty, which must be juristically defined correctly, not as the monopoly to coerce or to rule, but as the monopoly to decide. This is the basis for Schmitt's doctrine of a decisionism. To better understand this, let us consider a lengthy passage in which he compares de Maistre to various anarchists. De Maistre spoke with particular fondness of sovereignty, which essentially meant decision. To him, the relevance of the state rested on the fact that it provided a decision, the relevance of the church on its rendering of the last decision that could not be appealed. Infallibility was for him the essence of the decision that cannot be appealed, and the infallibility of the spiritual order was of the same nature as the sovereignty of the state order. The two words infallibility and sovereignty were perfectly synonymous. To him, every sovereignty acted as if it were infallible, every government was absolute, a sentence that an anarchist could pronounce verbatim, even if his intention was an entirely different one. In this sentence there lies the clearest antithesis in the entire history of political ideas. All the anarchist theories from Babeuf to Bakunin, Kropotkin, and Otto Gross revolve around the one axiom: the people are good, but the magistrate is corruptible. De Maistre asserted the exact opposite, namely, that authority as such is good once it exists, any government is good once it is established, the reason being that a decision is inherent in the mere existence of a governmental authority, and the decision as such is in turn valuable precisely because, as far as the most essential issues are concerned, making a decision is more important than how a decision is made. It is definitely not in our interest that a question be decided in one way or another, but that it be decided without delay and without appeal. In practice, not to be subject to error and not to be accused of error were for him the same. The important point was that no higher authority could review the decision. This may make it sound as if de Maistre and Schmitt are putting the sovereign beyond criticism or reproach, however they simply mean that in practice sovereignty rests on a decisionism. Note that this thinking is also present in Pareto's man of action. If the sovereign is arbitrary or corrupt or tyrannical, he will fail to uphold his key obligation, which is to uphold order and stability, and therefore be illegitimate. The sovereign who cannot protect has no right to demand obedience. George Schwab formalized Schmitt's theory in the following diagram. To explain this, Jesus is the Christ is the political formula. This can be replaced with liberty, fraternity, equality, the will of the people, or any other empty slogan. Quis interpretabiter? Is it who interprets the slogan? Auctoritas, non veritas. Means to authority, not truth, makes law. Postestas directa, non indirecta. Means that direct power, rather than indirect power, has authority, and this is the axis on which legitimate sovereignty must turn. The individual, who is at the bottom of the diagram, exchanges his obedience for protection from the sovereign. Schmitt thus showed that all power has this essentially theological and decisionist character. Schmitt's thinking has profound and far-reaching consequences for the myths of liberalism. Let me name 5 of them. 1. The illusion of equality under the rule of law. As soon as we admit the exception, all pretenses to such equality must be dropped. 2. That the state itself is nothing but law. The opponents that Schmitt stalks in the first 2 chapters of political theology are the proponents who advance the thesis that the state can be reduced to law, that the state is nothing but law, and that law is a total, seamless, exhaustive whole. 3. That the judiciary is neutral and impartial and somehow separate from politics. This self-evidently can never be the case, especially as the judiciary are subject to the sovereign who, by necessity, always stands above them. Franklin D. Roosevelt, one of the few U.S. presidents who achieved sovereignty, not only attempted to pack the courts and pass mandatory retirement ages for justices in a bid to discipline the Supreme Court after it ruled 8 of his New Deal measures unconstitutional, but also broke with convention and ran for 3rd and 4th terms. Even if Roosevelt did not get his own way on every score, the machinations of Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes, himself a presidential candidate in 1916, demonstrate that the concept of a neutral apolitical judiciary is nonsense. Follow the related notion that the state can ever be a secular, which is to say devoid of a religious doctrine, there must be a political theology, Jesus is the Christ, liberty, fraternity, equality, the will of the people, diversity is our strength, and so on. And, therefore, 5. That no state institutions or institutions which rely on the state for their continued existence can be agnostic to that official faith. This leads naturally to Schmitt's second famous thesis: the concept of the state presupposes the concept of the political. The specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy. Schmitt himself saw tremendous significance in the first of these statements, which opens the concept of the political as a Copernican moment in state theory. What did Schmitt overturn? In short, most theories of the state suppose that politics is something that takes place within the state, while Schmitt maintained that politics comes both prior to and separate from the state. Thus, politics has a potential to destabilize the state. If a state has genuine pretenses to neutrality, as did the Weimar Republic in which he was writing, then it would be liable not only to contain great political animosity but also find itself dislodged by a political force that had no such pretenses. Thus, the state cannot be neutral and must itself become political, which then necessitates recognizing the friend-enemy distinction. By a friend and enemy, Schmitt was not talking about animosity on a personal and private level, but rather on a public one. Even the precept love your enemies, diligite inimicos vestros, Matt. 5:44, Luke 6:27, clearly refers to the private enemy, inimicus, and not the public one, hostes. Public enmity, according to Schmidt, is not a private matter but in our epoch exclusively a concern of the political unit, the national sovereign state. The extreme end state of a public enemy is war. At the most modest level it might be a disagreement over a tax rate. Conflicts over minor disagreements of policy do not attain the status of the political until they increase in intensity and become irreconcilable. The non-neutrality of the state might be understood more readily in the following table. In practice, those within a political community will struggle to distinguish their enemies. Hence, it has been the practice of communists to label all their opponents fascists, which also increasingly became the modus operandi of social democrats, liberal democrats, and so-called neoconservatives, many of whom were former Trotskyists, after World War II. In the political theology of communism, it is necessary to paint fascism as liberalism in a decayed state fighting a rearguard action in the interests of capital. Anti-Stalinist leftists, anarchists, left communists and social democrats in the 1920s and 30s coined the phrase a red fascism to describe Stalin's doctrine of socialism in one country. In the political theology of liberalism, it was necessary to tie together communism and fascism, completely effacing their substantive differences, by viewing them as two sides of the same totalitarian and anti-Semitic coin. Later it was necessary even to paint fundamentalist Islam as Islamofascism, which was retroactively applied as a decades-long struggle. One neoconservative writer even attempted to coin the absurd title liberal fascism. In the final analysis, within a liberal democracy, it is fascism that becomes the decisive and ultimate enemy rather than totalitarianism or communism. The experiences of Joseph McCarthy and his vilification by liberal history demonstrate that even during the Cold War, the enemy was not communism per se, but rather the Soviet bloc as a counter-hegemon and stand-in Hitler. From the fascist point of view, liberals and communists allied against them in World War II. Although debates will range about whether Francisco Franco was a fascist, his enemies in the Spanish Civil War, the Republican Alliance, consisted of internationally backed liberals, socialists, and communists, while Mussolini and Hitler lent the Nationalist Alliance their support. From the realist perspective of Schmidt, there is no structural difference between the liberal state, the communist state, and the fascist state, or indeed any other state. The only difference is the extent to which a regime may obscure the nature of its power, or else genuinely buy into myths of neutrality. Viewed in this way, a state wedded to liberal democracy is as totalitarian as any other since, by its very nature, it will be unable to tolerate any leaders who are not always already liberal democrats. Should such leaders rise, the stalwarts of liberal democracy will perceive them as populists, fascists, threats to democracy, and so on. The extent of free speech, free inquiry, free thought, and so on is a liberal delusion. In fact, the range of allowable opinion is always exceedingly narrow, and the liberal democratic state is marked by its intolerance and spectacular inability to imagine any worldview that is not its own. The dominance of liberal political theology is total. Schmidt would not have disagreed with Oswald Spengler, who wrote in The Decline of the West, England, too, discovered the ideal of a free press, and discovered along with it that the press serves him who owns it. It does not spread free opinion, it generates it. Without the readers observing it, the paper, and himself with it, changes masters. Here also money triumphs and forces the free spirits into its service. No tamer has his animals more under his power. Unleash the people as reader mass, and it will storm through the streets and hurl itself upon the target indicated, terrifying and breaking windows, a hint to the press staff, and it will become quiet and go home. The press today is an army with carefully organized arms and branches, with journalists as officers, and readers as soldiers. But here, as in every army, the soldier obeys blindly, and war aims and operation plans change without his knowledge. The reader neither knows, nor is allowed to know, the purposes for which he is used, nor even the role that he is to play. A more appalling caricature of freedom of thought cannot be imagined. Formerly a man did not dare to think freely. Now he dares, but cannot. His will to think is only a willingness to think to order, and this is what he feels as his liberty. As Edward Bernays would go on to say, these are the invisible rulers who control the destinies of millions. In some department of our daily lives, in which we imagine ourselves as free agents, we are ruled by dictators exercising great power. The point is that viewed from the outside, liberal democracy looks just as totalitarian as any other regime, even if it relies more on subtle persuasion, nudge techniques, and other psychological tricks than coercion to obtain its results. In Pareto's terms, liberal democracy leads to rule by foxes as opposed to lions. Liberal democracy rules, as Schmitt was later to call it, by a tyranny of values in which anti-liberal, anti-democratic, anti-materialist thinking is beyond the pale and banished from polite society. Some have been quick to point out Schmitt's cynical hypocrisy for complaining when the boot was on the other foot, so to speak, but it is perfectly consistent with his friend-enemy distinction. When friends are in power and imposing their values, that is good. When enemies are in power and imposing theirs, that is bad. This is politics, war by another name. As Paul Gottfried argues, Schmitt wishes us to know that no amount of neutralization can render human relations apolitical. However earnestly we strive for a programmed and peaceful society, the political, as friend-enemy distinction, continues to resurface. Carl Schmitt is a thoroughly realist thinker who sees through every liberal and democratic delusion. He cuts through all myths to see plainly and without embellishment the essence of power in practice, in Act 2, as opposed to in theory or in laws, which are no better than sheets of inert paper. These are lessons that, much like those of the elite theorists, people are often unwilling to admit either to themselves or to others. But as Schmitt would surely recognize with Pareto, people often seek refuge in their delusions. Critiques that accuse Schmitt himself of being an authoritarian seem to miss the fact that he is suggesting that all successful states, including liberal democratic ones, function in the same way. Sovereign power rests in the person or persons who decide the exception and who interpret the mantras of the official political theology. Politics rests on the friend-enemy distinction, and the state must itself be political and define its enemies.